Hello, and welcome to episode 24 of Sir Astro's Marvel Crisis Protocol painting series. In this video, I'll be painting Heimdall from Atomic Mass Games' Marvel Crisis Protocol. Heimdall is an interesting figure to paint, presenting opportunities to develop our non-metallic metal technique and have some fun with the Bifrost. In preparing to paint the figure, you can see I chose to initially keep Heimdall separate from the Bifrost, and as usual, I'm priming the model in black, followed with some grey and white zenithal highlights applied from above. For the pieces of Bifrost, I chose to prime in grey, followed with some pure white zenithal highlights, but I think a plain prime in white would also be fine. I'm then going to paint the Bifrost, mostly using contrast colours, to help me achieve a look that isn't too heavy or oversaturated. We can then provide the base colours for Heimdall himself, along with a little dark lining, followed with the highlights and finishing touches, where I'll be enjoying some non-metallic metal effects and providing a final optional elemental touch to the Bifrost. As usual, you'll find more detailed chapter links below. Let's begin by painting the Bifrost. Here you can see the initial selection of contrast paints I chose to provide the main colours for the Bifrost. You should feel free to experiment with whatever colours you like here, but I chose to avoid too heavy use of the primary colours, favouring magentas, oranges, greens etc. for a more pastel look. I'll be thinning the paints on the fly as I go with some contrast medium to keep the tone fairly light and crystal-like. I'm now preparing my first few colours in the palette, starting with a mix of Magos Purple and Blood Angel's Red, thinned out to create a nice level of translucency. And I'd like to blend this into some Iyanden Yellow for the first section of Bifrost. I'm starting on the back to check that I'm happy with the opacity. I'm now blending this into the Iyanden Yellow whilst the paint is still wet. And towards the end of this piece, I'm blending into a little Plaguebearer Flesh. I'm beginning the next piece with the Plaguebearer Flesh, which I'm then blending into a mix of Militarum Green and Warp Lightning. Towards the end of this piece, I'm introducing some more turquoise Akhelian Green. Then for the last piece, I'm moving from the Akhelian Green to Talassar Blue, and back to a little Magos Purple. And here I'm just painting the small piece at the base of the sword, using the purple to reddish tones. This is the first place you could actually stop and call the Bifrost done if you like. I've chosen to go a little further, however, by using some regular paints to introduce a little extra variety. I'm keeping the colours pretty light and just mixing variations on the existing tones to pick out some of the individual sections of the Bifrost. Here I'm mixing some yellowish greens, for example. and I'm now going a little more orange. And I'm now doing the same thing elsewhere, just breaking things up a little whilst maintaining the overall gradient. There's also nothing wrong with applying some additional contrast colour if you like. I'll be applying an optional frosting effect here later on, but now let's apply our base colours to Heimdall. I've decided to begin by placing my initial tones for the base, using mainly graphite mixed with black, along with some light dry brushing, black lining, and a few rough highlights. I'll be refining this later on, but wanted the main tones in place just so I can more easily get a feel for the overall look of the model as I paint. And I'm now using my standard approach to painting the eyes, where I'm first placing the whites of the eyes using an off-white tone, not worrying too much about the accuracy for now. And I'm then placing my pupils with some black, before trimming back the surrounding area. I'm now painting the skin using dark brown ochre mixed with some burnt sienna. Something like Citadel's Rhine Oxide would also be a good choice here if you're after a dark skin tone. This might need a couple of layers. Next I'm using Petroleum Gray for the facial hair. Moving on to the clothing, I've chosen to use red leather, firstly for the boots. And I'm now using this for the sleeves as well as the gloves. Moving down the figure, I'm also using this for the leather straps hanging from the waist, as well as the backs of the knees. This just helps to break the miniature up a little, whilst also restricting the colour palette, which I felt was important due to the colour interest already provided by the Bifrost. Next I'm using brown leather mixed with a little black for the legs and the belt. For all of the metal armour, I'm using burnt umber mixed with a little Naples Yellow. This will need a couple of layers, although the coverage doesn't need to be completely opaque. Next I'm painting the fur, where I'm going to loosely blend some Petroleum Gray, Brown Gray and Birch for the shadows, midtones and highlights respectively. And I like to tidy up as I go. Here I've decided to paint the handle and crossguard of the sword with the same tone I used for the armour. And for the blade, I'm mixing a bluish grey tone using black, white and Prussian blue. Finally, I'm adding a little black lining to help separate some of these areas, especially as they're quite close in tone. Now ready to add the highlights and finishing touches. I'm going to begin by highlighting the skin, by firstly increasing the amount of burnt sienna in the base tone mix, and then by adding some light skin for the lighter highlights. Whatever paint range you might be using, I think the key thing here is to achieve some nice rich oranges in the mid-tones. I'm now mixing in some of the light skin. When we find there's not much room to move the brush, a little stippling action can help. I like to add a pretty bright glint to the lower lip. Next I'm mixing increasing amounts of white sands into the Petroleum Gray to highlight the facial hair. And for the fur, I'm simply doing a little refining and tidying up using the original 3 tones. We can also build up some finer textures along the way. Next I'm going to highlight the red leather, but I'm first applying some Nuln Oil to the leather straps to see if we can get some easy shading in the recesses. And for the highlights I'm mixing in some Kalahari Orange, followed with some Tenere Yellow. For these straps and the boots, I want quite a rough and scratchy texture. I'm now adding my Tenere Yellow for the brighter highlights. Just like in the Juggernaut video, we can even use pure Tenere Yellow followed with some darker glazes to achieve some nice multi-layered textures. I'm not spending too long here however, as much of the lower model will be obscured by the Bifrost. Next I'm providing a few quick highlights to the legs, firstly working up to brown leather, followed once again with the addition of some Tenere Yellow, and a dark glaze for the weathered belt if needed. For the non-metallic metal gold, I'll simply be adding increasing amounts of Naples Yellow to the base tone, along with varying amounts of white for the brighter highlights. I'll then be adding a few touches of ambient colour to show light being reflected from the adjacent Bifrost. I'm starting on the lower body to begin with. You can see I'm gradually building up the strength of the Naples Yellow, which has a nice opaque finish. I'll sometimes return to expand on the midtones along the way. We naturally want to define all of these little edges and raised details, and where there are larger areas, we can play around a bit with our placement of light and shade. I'm not going quite to pure Naples Yellow to control the saturation, but I'm now mixing in some white with the Naples Yellow to continue pushing up the brightness. You can see I'm toying with a few sketchy glints as I go. I'm painting these gems on the knees in black for the time being. This is now just a pure white and Naples Yellow mix. I'll occasionally have to redraw some touches of shadow. I'm going as light as a pale sand or ivory tone. I'm now painting the rest of the armour in the same way, and we can be pretty sketchy for the area just behind the sword, which isn't really visible. Here on the forearms, I'm placing a primary zenithal highlight on top, with a secondary highlight picking out the lower edge below. And on this pauldron, you can see I've chosen to break things up with a primary strip of shadow slightly towards the rear. How sketchy, smooth or textured you want to be is entirely a matter of personal style and taste. One of the most important aspects of working in this style is learning how to pace the way we build up the intensity of the values. In other words, learning how to stretch out the midtones and reserve the brightest highlights for a few key areas. I'm not actually sure if these parts are supposed to be metal or leather. I'm now working my way up to the brighter highlights. I'm also pushing the depth of some of the shadows using the burnt umber mixed with a little black. I'm now going back and forth a little, playing with some final touches of both highlight and shadow. I'm now going to add a few coloured reflections to the armour based on the proximity of the Bifrost. I'm not sure how intense I want to go here, so I'm starting quite gently with some spring green mixed with some Naples Yellow, which I'm first applying to the back of the left pauldron. You can see I've kept the paint pretty thin to allow me to begin with some gentle tints. I'm now trying some brighter, more concentrated glints. We can also tint the other nearby sections of metal. Next I'm using some magenta mixed with Naples Yellow to add a few coloured reflections to the front left of the figure. And I'm now playing with a mix of turquoise blue and primary blue for the other side. You can once again see me pushing the intensity until I have a look that I'm happy with. Before moving on to the sword, I'm painting the gems on the knees using magenta mixed with a little black. I'm now mixing in some Naples Yellow and building up a highlight on the lower half. Some additional magenta can help smooth the transition. And we can use some white to add a sharp glint at the top. Moving on to the blade of the sword, I'm going to begin by placing my initial highlights by mixing a slightly lighter version of the blue-grey base tone. You can create whatever pattern of light and shade you like here. I'm just trying not to be too regular or symmetrical. We can also go ahead and place some initial edge highlights. I'm also placing a few sketchy highlights on the back. Next we want to blend the highlights in a bit. One way to do that is to use a slightly thinned intermediate tone. So here I'm going just a shade darker and using this to begin softening out the transitions. This will turn out a little darker once dry, and I don't need these transitions to be especially smooth at this stage. I'm now going to begin pushing the highlights up by mixing in some vanilla white. You can see I'm using a series of small horizontal strokes to do this. I'm now gently increasing the brightness in a couple more stages. At this point I decided to begin introducing some colour along with the additional highlights. So here I'm glazing in a little of the Prussian Blue. And I'm continuing to push up the value of the highlights, adding a combination of white and vanilla white. My central edge turned out a little crooked, but nothing that can't be fixed with a little correction. This is where I've decided I'd like to build up my biggest and brightest glinting highlight to provide a focal point. I'm now glazing on some additional colours inspired by the adjacent Bifrost, mostly into the midtones. This is Magenta mixed with some Naples Yellow. Notice this also serves to further smooth out some of the transitions. And here I'm using a mix of primary blue and turquoise blue. I'm also playing with some darker tones, such as the Prussian Blue you can see here, and elsewhere a little purple. And I'm now returning to the highlights. The brightest tone you'll see me using is a pure mix of white and vanilla white. Here I'm just expanding the glint on the central ridge. I'm also freely adding some small additional notches, glints and scratches. And I'm now adding my last few touches. With that done, I'm now just refining the base a little before applying a coat of matte varnish to give me a stronger surface to glue the Bifrost onto. I'm now gluing the Bifrost down with a little super glue. One last entirely optional effect I've chosen to add to the Bifrost is to use the Chrysel Ice and Snow Wash by Precision Ice and Snow. All we do is give it a good shake, then apply it quite liberally, like you would with a standard wash. You won't see an immediate effect, but once it's dry, you'll find nice sparkling white deposits in the recesses, which I feel gives quite a nice elemental effect. I'm now just painting the studs on the belt, which I missed earlier, using the blue-grey tones we used for the sword. And after painting the rim of the base in black, I'm pushing one or two highlights elsewhere on the model. And this completes Heimdall. Thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the episode. As usual, you'll find a full products list in the video description, along with links to all of the places I can be found on social media, as well as the various music platforms. My sincerest thanks go to my amazing patrons for funding this work. If you'd like to help support what I do, you can find out more by hitting the Patreon link. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Marvel Crisis Protocol. Happy painting!